Have you ever stopped and quietly wondered why the more awake you become, the more chaotic life seems to feel? That question alone has unsettled more hearts than most people realize. Because somewhere along the way, many of us were taught an unspoken promise that awakening would feel like light flooding in, like peace arriving and staying, like clarity replacing confusion once and for all. We imagined it as a gentle sunrise that warms everything evenly, calm, beautiful, safe. But for many of you watching right now, that is not what happened. Instead, life may have started to feel unstable. Relationships shifted, old certainties dissolved. Your inner world became louder before it ever grew quieter, and a subtle fear crept in, the fear that something had gone wrong, that maybe you misunderstood this whole idea of awakening, or worse, that you somehow failed at it. Here is the truth that almost no one warns you about. Awakening does not begin as comfort. It begins as disruption, not because something is broken within you, but because something very old is loosening its grip. Awakening is not the moment when everything finally makes sense. It is the moment when the structures you once relied on to make sense of life begin to fall away. And when that happens, the mind interprets it as danger. The ego calls it chaos. But consciousness recognizes it as movement deep, intelligent movement toward truth. Think of it like this. Imagine living your entire life inside a house with dim lighting. You learned how to navigate the furniture in the dark. You memorized where everything was. You felt safe, not because the house was perfect, but because it was familiar. Then one day, someone opens all the windows at once. Sunlight pours in. At first, it hurts your eyes. Dust becomes visible everywhere. You see cracks you never noticed before. And for a moment, you might wish the light had never entered at all. But the light did not create the dust. It revealed what was already there. This is what awakening often feels like in the beginning. Not enlightenment, but exposure. Not peace, but heightened awareness. You start noticing the misalignments you once ignored, the emotional patterns you justified, the beliefs you inherited without question. And because awareness amplifies experience, everything feels more intense before it feels more free. This is where many people quietly panic. They look around at their lives and think, why does everything feel harder now? I thought I was supposed to feel better. They don't say it out loud, because spiritual culture often rewards positivity and silence about struggle. So instead, they assume something is wrong with them. They assume they are regressing. But listen closely and let this land gently. If you are feeling disoriented, if you are feeling emotionally raw, if you are questioning things that once felt unquestionable, if you feel tired in a way sleep doesn't fix, if you feel alone even when you are not physically alone, you may not be lost at all. You may be waking up. Awakening is not the ego becoming better behaved. It is the ego slowly realizing it is not in control. And that realization feels threatening before it feels liberating. The ego survives through certainty, labels, and narratives. Awakening removes those supports, one by one, not violently, but relentlessly, like a river that no longer strains to flow uphill, but finally releases itself into its natural direction. From a deeper perspective, even a quantum one, this makes perfect sense. When consciousness shifts, the entire energetic system reorganizes. Old patterns lose coherence. New ones have not yet stabilized. You are, in a very real way, between frequencies, and any system in transition feels unstable before it reaches a new equilibrium. Nature shows us this all the time. A caterpillar does not become a butterfly by upgrading itself. It dissolves first. Inside the cocoon, there is a stage that biologists describe as near total breakdown. The old form cannot survive the new expression, and yet, nothing has gone wrong. That apparent collapse is the intelligence of transformation at work. Human awakening follows a similar rhythm. The phase no one romanticizes is the in-between, the space where the old identity no longer fits, but the new one has not yet emerged, where certainty gives way to sensitivity, where control gives way to listening, where effort gives way to something far more subtle: allowance. This is why forcing yourself to stay positive during awakening often creates more suffering, not less. Positivity becomes another form of resistance, another attempt by the mind to regain control. True awakening is not about managing reality better. It is about releasing the need to manage it at all. And here is something deeply important to understand. Awakening is not something you do. It is something you allow. You do not awaken by trying harder. You awaken by softening, by listening, by letting life move through you instead of constantly bracing against it. Many people watching this have spent years being strong, holding it together, making sense of things for everyone else. Awakening invites you to do something radically different, to stop holding and start trusting. Not blind trust, not passive resignation, but a quiet, grounded trust in the intelligence that is already moving your life. That intelligence does not shout. It does not rush. It does not argue with your mind. It waits patiently for your permission to lead. And that is the deeper intention of this video. Not to label your experiences, not to convince you of a belief system, but to help you recognize what may already be happening within you so fear no longer defines it. Because once fear loosens its grip, something extraordinary becomes possible. You stop interpreting discomfort as failure. You stop resisting the shedding of old skins. You begin to see that confusion can be a doorway, not a dead end. That exhaustion can be a signal to rest into a deeper current, not push against it. Awakening does not ask you to become someone else. It asks you to stop pretending you were ever separate. So if your life feels unfamiliar right now, if the ground beneath old identities feels less solid, if the answers you once relied on no longer satisfy, take a breath. Nothing has gone wrong. You are not falling apart. You are falling open, and in the space that opens gently, gradually, without force, a different way of being begins to reveal itself. Not louder, not brighter, but truer, quieter, more aligned with the rhythm of life itself. From here, we do not rush. We do not fix. We do not force clarity. We allow. And in that allowing, awakening stops feeling like a crisis and starts revealing itself as a return. 1. Feeling lost inside your own life. There comes a quiet, unsettling moment in the awakening process when you realize that the life you are standing in no longer feels like home. Nothing dramatic has happened on the outside. The same places are there, the same routines, the same people, and yet something subtle has shifted inside you. You walk into familiar environments and feel like a visitor rather than a resident. It is as if your inner compass has recalibrated overnight, and the old landmarks no longer register the same way. This is not rejection, and it is not arrogance. It is awareness outgrowing its previous container. You may notice this first in the smallest moments. Conversations you once enjoyed now feel strangely hollow. Not wrong, not offensive, just empty. The words are there, but the energy behind them no longer reaches you. You nod politely, you listen, you respond, but something inside you remains untouched. It can feel confusing, even guilt-inducing, especially if these conversations involve people you care about. You might ask yourself why you can no longer engage the way you used to, why you feel like you are watching life from a slight distance rather than participating fully. This is often where self-judgment creeps in, whispering that you are becoming disconnected or ungrateful. But what is actually happening is far more gentle and far more intelligent than that. There is a distinct sensation that arises during this phase, a feeling of standing between two worlds. The old world, built on familiar identities, roles, and expectations, no longer feels authentic enough to inhabit fully. And yet the new world, the one aligned with your deeper truth, has not fully revealed itself. You are suspended in between, not anchored to the past, not yet rooted in the future. The mind dislikes this space intensely because it cannot categorize it. It calls it uncertainty. It calls it instability. But consciousness recognizes it as a necessary pause, a threshold moment where transformation quietly gathers its strength. From lived experience, I can tell you, this space can feel lonely, even when you are surrounded by people. Not because you are unloved, but because the part of you that once connected through shared identities is dissolving. When the ego begins to loosen, it stops reaching outward for validation in the same way. It no longer feeds on recognition or agreement to feel real. And so, the old mechanisms of belonging stop working. This can feel like loss, but it is actually subtraction, the gentle removal of what no longer matches your inner frequency. At a deeper level, What you are experiencing is the slow disintegration of an outdated self-image. The version of you that knew exactly who it was, how it fit, and what it was supposed to want is fading. This can be frightening, especially in cultures that equate identity with stability and worth. When that familiar structure weakens, the nervous system often interprets it as danger. You may feel restless, unsettled, or vaguely anxious without knowing why. The mind searches for something to grab onto, a new label, a new role, a new explanation, but nothing quite fits. And that is not a failure of imagination. It is a sign that the old framework can no longer contain what you are becoming. What makes this stage particularly challenging is that the new sense of self has not yet formed. There is no clear replacement waiting to step in. Instead, there is openness, spaciousness, unknowing. And to a mind trained to equate knowing with safety, this can feel like standing on thin air. But in reality, this openness is not emptiness. It is potential. It is consciousness, loosening its grip on form so it can reorganize itself at a higher level of coherence. If you look at this through a more energetic or quantum lens, the experience makes sense. When a system undergoes transformation, it must pass through a phase of instability. Old patterns lose energy and collapse before new ones stabilize. During this transition, the system appears disordered, but beneath the surface, a more refined structure is emerging. You are not losing direction. You are shedding a map that no longer matches the terrain of who you are becoming. It is important to understand that this feeling of not belonging is not a sign that you need to escape your life or reject it. It is an invitation to relate to it differently. Instead of trying to force yourself back into old forms of engagement, awakening asks you to stay present with the discomfort without rushing to resolve it, to allow the unfamiliar sensation to be there without immediately labeling it as a problem. This requires a kind of inner honesty that cannot be faked and cannot be hurried. Many people try to bypass this phase by creating a new identity too quickly, adopting new beliefs, new language, or new spiritual personas in an attempt to regain certainty. While this can provide temporary relief, it often delays the deeper integration that is trying to take place. True transformation does not come from replacing one identity with another. It comes from realizing that you are not confined to any identity at all. There is a quiet wisdom in allowing yourself to feel out of place for a while. It teaches humility. It softens the need to perform. It invites you to listen more deeply, not just to others, but to the subtle movements within your own awareness. In this listening, something begins to shift. You start to notice that even without a clear sense of who you are becoming, there is a steadiness beneath the uncertainty, a presence that remains intact even as roles dissolve. That presence is not trying to belong anywhere, because it is already whole. This is why this stage is not about finding a new direction as much as it is about releasing the illusion that you ever needed one to be complete. The sense of being lost is often the mind's reaction to losing control, not the soul's assessment of the journey. From the perspective of consciousness, nothing essential has been misplaced. What has been lost are the reference points that once defined you, and while their absence can feel disorienting, it also creates space for a more authentic alignment to emerge. In time, and without force, a new way of relating to life begins to take shape, not built on fitting in, but on resonance. Not on effort, but on ease. You start to recognize environments and connections that feel nourishing rather than draining. Not because they validate you, but because they allow you to be present without strain. This shift does not come from searching harder. It comes from resting more deeply into yourself and trusting the intelligence of the unfolding process. So if you find yourself feeling like a stranger in your own life, pause before you assume something has gone wrong. This experience is not a detour. It is a recalibration, a reorganization of awareness that cannot be rushed or neatly explained. You are not drifting aimlessly. You are in the middle of a profound internal restructuring, one that is quietly aligning you with a truer expression of who you are. And the most important thing to remember during this phase is simple, even if it does not feel easy. You do not need to fix this feeling. You do not need to force clarity or recreate belonging. Your only real invitation right now is to allow the process to move through you, gently, patiently, without resistance, like a river that has stopped fighting the current and has begun, at last, to flow in the direction it was always meant to go. 2. When relationships begin to crack or quietly disappear. One of the most painful and misunderstood phases of awakening arrives not through dramatic inner visions, but through the slow, almost imperceptible shifting of human connections. Relationships that once felt solid begin to feel strained without any obvious conflict. People you shared years of history with now feel strangely distant, even when nothing specific has happened between you. And what hurts the most is that there is often no clear villain, no argument you can point to, no single moment where everything broke apart. Things simply grow quiet. And in that quiet, you start to realize that the resonance you once shared is no longer there. At first, the mind tries to make sense of it in familiar ways. It searches for mistakes, for misunderstandings, for something you should fix or explain. But awakening does not operate through blame or correction. It operates through alignment. And alignment is not something you negotiate or convince others into. It either exists or it gently fades. When consciousness shifts, the frequency at which you meet the world changes, and relationships that were built on the old frequency begin to feel effortful, heavy, or strangely empty. You may notice that conversations with certain people no longer flow the way they used to, not because anyone has become unkind, but because the energetic bridge that once carried mutual understanding has thinned. Silence begins to appear more often than disagreement. There are fewer arguments, fewer emotional spikes, but also less intimacy. You stop feeling the need to explain your inner world, not out of secrecy, but because you sense that words would not truly land. What once felt urgent to share now feels unnecessary. And this shift can feel confusing, especially if you were taught that closeness is maintained through constant communication and emotional processing. From the outside, it might look like withdrawal. From the inside, it feels more like stillness, a quiet recognition that forcing connection where resonance no longer exists only creates friction. Awakening does not make you colder. It makes you more honest with your energy. You begin to feel, rather than think, when a connection is aligned. And when it is not, your system naturally relaxes its grip. This is often where guilt arises. You might wonder if you are abandoning people, or if you are becoming selfish or detached. But there is an important distinction to understand here. Detachment in awakening is not indifference. It is non-resistance. You stop clinging to relationships out of fear, obligation, or identity. You stop maintaining bonds simply because they once mattered. Instead, you allow connections to exist in truth, even if that truth means change. There is a deep wisdom in this process, though it rarely feels gentle at first. When two people are no longer vibrating at a compatible frequency, maintaining the relationship requires constant effort, compromise, and self-betrayal. One person must shrink, perform, or stay silent to preserve harmony. Awakening gradually removes the willingness to do that, not through rebellion, but through exhaustion. You simply can no longer pretend, and when pretending stops, incompatible energies naturally drift apart. It is important to say this clearly, because many people carry unnecessary shame here. Relationships ending or transforming during awakening is not a punishment. It is not karma catching up with you. It is not a sign that you failed to love correctly. It is recalibration. The same intelligence that reorganizes stars and seasons is reorganizing your relational field. What no longer matches your inner truth cannot stay anchored, no matter how meaningful it once was. This can be especially painful when the relationships involved are long-standing or deeply emotional. Family members, old friends, partners who shared entire chapters of your life. Awakening does not erase the value of what was shared. It does not invalidate the love that once existed. It simply acknowledges that growth changes form. And sometimes, love expresses itself not by staying, but by releasing. One of the most noticeable shifts during this stage is the disappearance of the urge to persuade. You stop trying to explain your evolution. You stop defending your choices. You stop justifying your boundaries, not because you do not care, but because you understand that understanding cannot be forced. Awakening teaches you that resonance is more powerful than reasoning. People who are aligned with your frequency will feel you without explanation. Those who are not will misunderstand you no matter how carefully you speak. This is not a failure of communication. It is a recognition of energetic truth. From a deeper perspective, relationships are not just emotional agreements. They are energetic exchanges. When both people are operating from similar levels of awareness, the exchange feels nourishing and expansive. When awareness shifts unevenly, the exchange can begin to feel draining or constrictive. The system responds by creating distance, not as rejection, but as self-regulation. Just as the body pulls away from what no longer supports health, consciousness pulls away from what no longer supports coherence. Many people resist this stage because they equate separation with loss. And on a human level, there is loss. Grief is real here. Memories resurface. Longing appears. You may mourn not only the person, but the version of yourself that existed within that relationship. That grief deserves tenderness. It does not mean you made the wrong choice. It means you are honoring what was real, even as you allow what is real now to take shape. What helps during this phase is remembering that awakening is not about minimizing pain. It is about meeting it honestly. Allow yourself to feel the sadness without turning it into a story of failure. Allow yourself to feel the space left behind without rushing to fill it. In that space, something important happens. You begin to experience connection differently, not as attachment, but as presence, not as dependence, but as mutual resonance. Over time, new forms of connection begin to emerge, often quietly, often unexpectedly. People appear who do not require explanation. Conversations feel nourishing rather than draining. Silence feels comfortable rather than awkward. You realize that connection does not have to be intense to be real. It only has to be true. These relationships may be fewer, but they are deeper, less dramatic, but more grounded. And perhaps the most profound shift of all is the one that happens within you. As external relationships fall away or transform, you begin to develop a steadier relationship with yourself. You stop using others as mirrors for your worth or identity. You stop outsourcing your sense of belonging. You discover that presence itself is a form of companionship, that being at home in your own awareness creates a foundation from which all other relationships naturally arise. So if you are watching this and noticing people drifting out of your life, or feeling distance where closeness once lived, pause before you judge the experience. Ask yourself not what you are losing, but what is being realigned. Trust that energy knows where it belongs. Trust that what leaves is making space for what can meet you where you truly are now. This is not abandonment. This is not failure. This is not punishment. This is the quiet intelligence of awakening, restoring balance where effort once replaced truth. 3. When emotions become intense and difficult to control, there is a phase in the awakening journey that almost no one prepares you for, not because it is rare, but because it challenges everything we have been taught about growth, strength, and healing. Instead of becoming calmer or more emotionally stable, you may suddenly feel overwhelmed from the inside. Emotions you believed were long resolved begin to surface without warning. Sadness arrives in moments that seem ordinary. Anger rises where patience once lived. Fear moves through your body even when your life appears safe and unchanged on the outside. And the most unsettling part is that these emotions often come without a clear reason or story attached to them. This is usually the moment when doubt sets in. You begin to wonder if you are moving backward, if something inside you is unraveling instead of healing. After all the inner work you have done, you might think you should be beyond this stage. But awakening does not follow the expectations of the mind, and healing does not progress in a straight, predictable line. What you are experiencing is not emotional instability. It is emotional truth finally being allowed into awareness. For most of our lives, we are taught to manage emotions rather than feel them. We learn to suppress grief so we can keep functioning. We learn to bury anger so we can stay accepted. We learn to numb fear so we can appear strong and in control. These strategies are not failures. They are survival responses. But emotions that are suppressed do not disappear. They are stored in the nervous system, in the muscles, in the breath, and in the subtle tension we carry without noticing. Awakening does not create these emotions. It removes the barriers that once kept them contained. As awareness deepens, it becomes harder to avoid what is happening inside. Distraction loses its power. Control becomes exhausting. The mind's habitual defenses soften, and what has been waiting beneath them finally has space to move. This is why emotions during awakening can feel sudden and intense. They are not new experiences. They are old energies returning to consciousness because the system finally feels safe enough to release them. You may notice that these emotional waves do not always make logical sense. You feel heavy without knowing why. You feel irritated without a clear trigger. You feel anxious even when nothing appears to be wrong. This can be deeply unsettling, especially for those who rely on understanding their emotions through reasoning and explanation. But much of what arises during this phase does not belong to the thinking mind. It belongs to the body. These are stored experiences, releasing themselves through sensation rather than narrative. From a biological perspective, this process is both natural and intelligent. The body holds memories and emotional charges that the conscious mind could not process when they originally occurred. When awareness becomes more present and grounded, the nervous system begins to trust that it no longer has to carry these burdens alone. And when that trust is established, release begins. Tears come without a clear thought behind them. Tightness moves through the chest or throat without explanation. Fatigue appears not because something is wrong, but because the body is doing deep work. This is often misunderstood as weakness or emotional regression. In reality, it is a sign that the system is finally doing what it was designed to do. The problem is not the intensity of the emotions. The difficulty lies in our resistance to feeling them. Most of us were never taught how to feel without trying to fix, suppress, or analyze. We were taught that emotions should be controlled, minimized, or justified. Awakening gently dismantles this conditioning and invites a new relationship with feeling itself. Consciousness begins to learn how to stay present with sensation without immediately turning it into a problem. This can feel frightening at first, because the ego associates emotional intensity with danger. It believes that if emotions are not controlled, they will overwhelm or destroy us. But presence is not dangerous. Avoidance is what keeps pain trapped in the system. When emotions are allowed to move freely, they complete themselves. There is an important distinction here that transforms this entire experience once it is understood. Feeling an emotion fully is not the same as being consumed by it. When you allow emotions to arise without resistance or dramatization, they move through you naturally. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is only when we suppress them, judge them, or turn them into identity that they linger and intensify. Awakening teaches you to feel deeply while remaining aware, to experience emotion without becoming lost inside it. This is why healing during this stage does not feel gentle. It feels raw and exposed. It feels like old wounds reopening. Many people assume that healing should feel soothing and peaceful, and when it does not, they believe they are doing something wrong. But healing is not about comfort. It is about integration. An emotion that is fully felt no longer needs to return. An experience that is fully acknowledged no longer needs to signal for attention. What feels like breakdown is often completion in progress. There is also an energetic aspect to this process that is rarely discussed in grounded terms. As awareness expands, the overall coherence of the system increases. Lower density emotional patterns that were once tolerated become uncomfortable to hold. They rise to the surface, not as punishment, but as part of a natural clearing process. The system is reorganizing itself, releasing what no longer matches its current level of awareness. This is not something you need to force or accelerate. It happens on its own when resistance softens. Trying to stay positive during this phase often creates more suffering rather than less. Positivity becomes another form of suppression, another way of telling yourself that certain emotions are unacceptable. True healing requires honesty, not constant optimism. It requires the willingness to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. This does not mean indulging emotions or acting them out. It means allowing them to be felt without judgment or urgency. What supports this phase more than anything else is gentleness, slowing down instead of pushing forward, listening to the body instead of overriding it, allowing rest without guilt, letting emotions rise and fall like weather, rather than treating them as permanent states. Over time, you begin to see that emotions are not instructions, they are signals, and once they are acknowledged, they naturally dissolve. Gradually, something begins to change. The intensity softens, not because you forced it to, but because there is nothing left to suppress. Emotional energy begins to move more freely. Feelings still arise, but they pass more quickly. There is less internal pressure, less buildup. Presence replaces control, and with it comes a quieter, deeper form of stability. You begin to trust your emotional life again. You stop fearing sadness, anger, or fear, because you have experienced that they do not destroy you when they are allowed. They inform you, they guide you, they pass, and in that trust, a deeper sense of safety emerges, one that does not depend on circumstances being perfect or emotions being pleasant. So if you find yourself in a season where emotions feel stronger than ever, resist the urge to label it as failure. This is not weakness. This is your system, learning how to be honest after years of protection. It is the intelligence of healing expressing itself, even when it does not look the way you expected. Healing is not always comfortable, but it is meaningful, and every wave you allow to move through you leaves behind more space, more clarity, and a deeper capacity to live without armor. 4. When you lose interest in what once felt important, there is a quiet and often unsettling shift that happens along the awakening path, one that many people do not recognize at first because it does not arrive with pain or drama, but with indifference. The things that once motivated you, the achievements you worked toward, the recognition you hoped for, and the status you quietly measured yourself against, begin to lose their grip on your attention. You may still function in the same world, go to the same places, and fulfill the same responsibilities, yet something inside you no longer leans forward with desire. What once felt essential now feels optional, and what once defined success begins to feel strangely hollow. At first, this can be deeply confusing. You might wonder what has happened to your drive, your ambition, your sense of direction. You may even fear that you are becoming lazy, unmotivated, or detached from life itself. In cultures that equate worth with productivity and achievement, losing interest in external markers of success can feel like losing your identity. But this shift is not a loss of vitality. It is a redirection of energy. What is fading is not your capacity to engage with life, but your dependence on external validation to feel whole. Success, status, and recognition serve an important role at certain stages of development. They give the ego a structure through which to organize itself, to feel seen, and to measure progress. There is nothing wrong with this. It is a natural phase of human growth. But awakening begins when the fulfillment you once expected from these pursuits no longer arrives. You reach milestones and feel strangely untouched by them. Compliments land softly and fade quickly. Goals that once fueled your days no longer spark genuine excitement. And in that moment, a subtle question arises, one that the mind does not immediately know how to answer. If these things no longer matter, then what does? This question often opens the door to a deeper discomfort, a sense of inner emptiness that can feel unsettling if misunderstood. When old motivations fall away, there is often a pause before new ones take shape. During this pause, the mind interprets the absence of desire as lack, as something missing. But this space is not a void in the negative sense. It is an opening, a clearing. The system is no longer being pulled outward by conditioned goals, but it has not yet learned how to rest inwardly without purpose. This is where many people panic and rush to fill the space. They create new ambitions, new identities, or new narratives to replace the old ones, hoping to restore a sense of direction. But awakening is not asking you to replace one set of goals with another. It is asking you to examine the source of your striving. It is inviting you to notice how much of your effort was driven by the need to become someone, rather than the joy of simply being. The emptiness you feel is not the absence of meaning. It is the absence of illusion. The illusion that worth must be earned. The illusion that fulfillment is found at the end of effort. The illusion that life becomes valuable only when it is impressive. When these beliefs loosen their hold, a quiet stillness remains. One that can feel unfamiliar and uncomfortable precisely because it does not demand anything from you. From the perspective of the ego, this loss of interest feels like loss of control. The ego thrives on goals, comparisons, and future-oriented striving. It needs something to chase in order to feel alive. When awakening begins to dissolve this pattern, the ego experiences it as threat. It tells you that you are wasting time, falling behind, or losing your edge. But what is actually happening is that the deeper intelligence within you is reclaiming authority. The part of you that does not need to prove its existence is beginning to lead. This shift does not mean you will stop participating in the world or caring about your life. It means the motivation behind your actions begins to change. Instead of acting to gain approval, security, or identity, you begin to act from alignment. Instead of pushing yourself toward outcomes, you allow actions to arise naturally from clarity. This can feel slower at first, because it is no longer fueled by fear or lack, but it is also far more sustainable, because it is not draining your nervous system in the process. The inner space that opens during this phase can feel uncomfortable because it is quiet. There is less mental noise, fewer internal commands, fewer imagined futures pulling at your attention. You may find yourself asking why you no longer feel compelled to prove anything, and the answer may unsettle you at first. It is because you are beginning to sense that nothing essential was ever missing. The drive to achieve was not wrong, but it was compensatory. It was trying to fill a perceived gap in being. Awakening does not fill that gap with something new. It reveals that the gap was never real. This is why the emptiness you feel is actually fertile. It is not a sign that life has lost meaning. It is a sign that meaning is no longer being manufactured by the mind. In this space, something quieter and more authentic begins to emerge. You may notice a growing appreciation for simple moments, a deeper presence in ordinary experiences, a sense of fulfillment that does not depend on outcomes. These are not dramatic changes, but they are profound. Over time, new impulses arise, but they are different in nature. They are not urgent. They are not driven by comparison. They feel calm, grounded, and internally aligned. You may feel drawn to create, to contribute, or to serve in ways that feel genuine rather than strategic. You may still pursue success, but it will no longer define you. It becomes an expression of your energy, not the source of your worth. This stage requires trust, because the mind cannot map it easily. There is no clear metric for progress, no guarantee of external reward. But there is a deep sense of integrity that grows as you stop betraying yourself for the sake of appearances. You begin to live from the inside out rather than the outside in. And while this may look like disengagement to others, it is actually a deeper form of engagement, one rooted in truth rather than performance. If you are in this phase and feeling unmotivated by the things that once mattered, resist the urge to judge yourself. This is not stagnation. It is reorientation. Your system is learning to operate without the constant pressure to become something else. It is discovering the relief of not having to chase meaning, because meaning is experienced directly through presence. The emptiness you feel is not asking to be filled. It is asking to be trusted. In time, as you rest into this space without forcing clarity, a different kind of purpose begins to reveal itself. Not as a grand mission, but as a quiet alignment with life itself. You act not because you need to arrive somewhere, but because action feels natural. You contribute not to be seen, but because energy wants to move through you. And in that movement, you find a fulfillment that no achievement ever provided. This is the gift hidden inside the loss of interest. The ego loosens its grip, and something truer steps forward. Not louder, not more impressive, but real. And that reality does not need to prove itself to anyone, including you. 5. When you begin to question every belief, there comes a point in the awakening process when certainty, once prized and protected, begins to feel heavy rather than reassuring. Beliefs that shaped your identity, guided your decisions, and gave you a sense of orientation in the world no longer sit as firmly as they once did. Ideas you accepted as truth, not because you examined them deeply but because they were familiar or inherited, start to wobble. At first, this can feel deeply unsettling. The mind prefers stable ground, even if that ground is built on assumptions. When those assumptions begin to crack, the sense of security they provided seems to vanish with them. You may notice this shift happening quietly. A statement that once felt obviously true now triggers hesitation. A familiar explanation no longer satisfies. You catch yourself pausing before agreeing, not out of rebellion, but out of sincerity. Something inside you is no longer willing to accept ideas simply because they are widely accepted, spiritually endorsed, or emotionally comforting. This is not cynicism. It is discernment, awakening. As this process deepens, you may begin to question even your own thoughts. The inner voice that once narrated your experience with authority starts to lose its absolute status. You notice how often your thoughts are reactive, conditioned, or rooted in fear rather than reality. You see how easily the mind constructs stories to protect its identity, justify its behavior, or maintain control. And for the first time, instead of automatically believing those stories, you observe them. This can feel disorienting, because the mind is used to being the primary interpreter of truth. When its authority is gently challenged, it reacts with confusion, and sometimes with anxiety. This is often where people worry they are losing their grounding. They say things like, "If I cannot trust my thoughts, what can I trust?" But awakening is not about mistrust. It is about clarity. You are not being asked to reject thinking altogether. You are being invited to see thinking for what it is: a tool, not an identity; a useful function, not an infallible guide. Blind belief, even when it feels comforting, comes at a cost. It limits perception. It narrows possibility. It creates invisible boundaries around what you allow yourself to question, feel, or become. When awakening begins, those boundaries soften. You no longer want answers handed to you, whether by authority figures, traditions, or even your past self. You want to see for yourself. This desire is not rebellious. It is honest, and honesty is the foundation of inner freedom. As you stop clinging to belief systems, you may notice a growing sense of mental spaciousness. At first, this space can feel uncomfortable. Without fixed beliefs to lean on, the mind feels exposed. It cannot immediately categorize experiences or predict outcomes. But in this openness, something important happens. Awareness shifts from participation to observation. Instead of being lost inside thoughts and beliefs, you begin to watch them arise and dissolve. You see how opinions form, how judgments appear, and how identities are constructed moment by moment. This shift from believing to observing is subtle, but it changes everything. You are no longer inside the story, trying to defend it. You are witnessing the story being told. And in that witnessing, the story loses its grip, not because it disappears, but because it no longer defines you. You begin to understand that beliefs are lenses, not truths. They shape perception, but they are not reality itself. From lived experience, this phase can feel lonely. When you question beliefs that others still hold tightly, conversations change. You may find it harder to participate in discussions that revolve around certainty and conviction, not because you think you are superior, but because you see how provisional all viewpoints really are. This does not make you empty. It makes you flexible. But flexibility is often misunderstood in a world that values strong opinions and clear stances. There is also a deeper emotional layer to this stage. Letting go of beliefs can feel like letting go of belonging. Beliefs often connect us to communities, traditions, and shared identities. When those beliefs loosen, the sense of connection tied to them can loosen as well. This can bring up fear, the fear of being wrong, the fear of being alone, the fear of standing without a mental framework to protect you. These fears are natural. They do not mean you should retreat. They mean you are stepping into a more honest relationship with reality. This questioning is not meant to leave you in perpetual doubt. It is meant to free you from unconscious agreement. Over time, a different kind of knowing begins to emerge. Not a belief that needs to be defended, but an understanding that feels grounded and calm. You start to trust direct experience more than conceptual explanation. You rely less on what should be true and more on what is actually present. This is where true inner freedom begins. Freedom does not come from replacing old beliefs with new ones. It comes from loosening the need for belief altogether. You realize that certainty was never the source of peace. Presence was, and presence does not require answers. It requires attention. As consciousness stabilizes in this observing mode, you become less reactive. Opinions no longer hook you as easily. You can listen without needing to agree or disagree. You can hold paradox without needing to resolve it immediately. This does not make you passive. It makes you grounded. Your sense of self becomes less dependent on being right and more rooted in being real. You may still hold values. You may still have preferences, but they are lighter now. They do not define your worth or dictate your identity. They are expressions, not prisons. And because of that, you become more open, more compassionate, and more curious. You see that everyone is operating from their own set of beliefs, most of which were never consciously chosen. This understanding softens judgment and deepens empathy. If you are in this phase and feel as though the ground beneath your understanding is shifting, do not rush to rebuild certainty. Allow the questions to exist without immediate answers. Trust that not knowing is not a failure of intelligence, but a sign of maturity. You are no longer satisfied with borrowed truths. You are learning how to stand in direct relationship with life. This is the beginning of inner freedom. Not the freedom to believe anything you want, but the freedom to see without filters. And in that clarity, a deeper wisdom begins to unfold. One that does not speak loudly, but speaks truly, guiding you not through rules or beliefs, but through awareness itself. 6. The growing need for solitude. The quiet begins to feel more nourishing than noise, not because the world has become wrong or people have lost their value, but because your nervous system is learning a new rhythm, one that no longer thrives on constant stimulation, explanation, or performance, and instead finds rest in simplicity, presence, and the absence of demand. You may notice that crowded rooms drain you faster than before, that conversations filled with opinions, urgency, and unspoken competition feel heavy on your chest, and that silence, once uncomfortable or even frightening, now carries a strange softness, like a place where nothing is required of you, and nothing needs to be proven. This need to be alone is not a rejection of others, nor is it a sign that something is broken inside you, but rather an instinctive turning inward, a natural response of consciousness when it is ready to listen more deeply instead of constantly reacting to the outside world. When you sit alone without distraction, without the urge to fix yourself or improve your life, something subtle begins to happen, because the mind slowly loosens its grip and the body starts to speak in sensations, emotions, and quiet signals that were previously drowned out by constant noise. You begin to realize that for much of your life, you were rarely truly alone, even when no one else was physically present, because your inner space was always occupied by borrowed voices, inherited beliefs, unfinished conversations, expectations, and imagined futures. And now there is a gentle exhaustion with carrying all of that weight. Solitude becomes a space where you no longer need to maintain an identity, defend your choices, or explain your journey. And in that space, there is a rare permission to simply be unfinished, uncertain, and honest, without consequence. This is not isolation driven by fear or avoidance, but a conscious retreat that allows the nervous system to reset, the emotional body to settle, and the deeper layers of awareness to surface without being interrupted or shaped by external influence. As time alone increases, you may start to understand that much of what you once called connection was actually noise, layered on top of loneliness, and that real connection, both with yourself and with others, requires first learning how to be at ease in your own presence. In the quiet, unresolved emotions do not disappear, but they soften, because you are no longer pushing them away or trying to analyze them into submission. And this gentle allowing creates space for integration rather than suppression. The mind, which once demanded constant answers, certainty, and direction, starts to relax its urgency, because in silence, it discovers that not everything needs to be understood immediately, and not every feeling needs to be labeled, justified, or fixed. You begin to sense the difference between being alone and feeling lonely, realizing that loneliness often came from being disconnected from yourself, while solitude now feels like a reunion with something familiar that was long ignored. Time alone stops feeling empty and starts to feel spacious, because without constant input, awareness naturally expands, and you notice small details, subtle shifts in mood, and the natural rise and fall of thoughts without becoming trapped inside them. There is a growing honesty in solitude, because without witnesses, there is no performance, and without performance, The truth does not need to shout or impress. It simply exists quietly and steadily. You may find yourself drawn to simpler routines, slower mornings, longer walks, and moments of stillness. Not because you are trying to become disciplined or enlightened, but because your system now recognizes what truly restores it. Silence becomes a teacher not through dramatic insights or mystical experiences, but through repetition, patience, and the quiet revelation that you are not required to constantly do, achieve, or explain in order to be worthy of peace. In this quiet, you begin to feel your own boundaries more clearly, sensing when something aligns and when it does not, without needing to justify those feelings with logic, stories, or external validation. Solitude offers a mirror that does not judge, correct, or compare. And in that mirror, you slowly recognize that much of your suffering came from being perpetually available to everything except yourself. As you spend more time alone, your tolerance for superficial conversations and forced interactions may naturally decrease. Not because you see yourself as better than others, but because your inner space has become more valuable and you are no longer willing to fill it with what feels empty. You may notice that you speak less but listen more, that you respond instead of react, and that silence between words no longer feels awkward but alive, carrying more truth than constant explanation ever did. Being alone teaches you how often you used noise to escape yourself, how busyness became a shield against feeling, and how distraction was once mistaken for fulfillment. Now, in solitude, you learn to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to change it, and this simple act of staying present becomes a form of self-respect that slowly rebuilds trust within you. The longer you remain in quiet, the more you realize that peace is not something you need to earn or chase, but something that emerges naturally when you stop abandoning yourself. This stage of needing more solitude can feel confusing, especially in a world that glorifies constant connection, visibility, and productivity. But what is happening beneath the surface is a deep recalibration of values and attention. You are learning that your energy is finite, that your presence is precious, and that not every invitation deserves a yes, not every conversation requires participation, and not every silence needs to be filled. In solitude, you start to hear a quieter voice beneath the noise of thought, a voice that does not command or criticize, but gently guides through feeling rather than force. This voice does not rush you, compare you, or demand clarity before you are ready. And the more you listen, the more you trust that you do not need to have everything figured out to move forward. The need to be alone is a sign that your awareness is maturing, that it no longer seeks constant confirmation from the outside world, and that it is ready to root itself in direct experience rather than borrowed meaning. Eventually, you understand that solitude is not the opposite of connection, but its foundation. Because only when you are at home within yourself can you meet others without losing who you are. And in that understanding, being alone stops feeling like something you endure and starts feeling like something you honor. A quiet space where nothing is missing and nothing needs to be added, because for the first time in a long while, you are fully here with yourself. 7. Unusual physical responses during awakening. There may come a time when your body begins to speak in ways that feel unfamiliar, sometimes unsettling, and often confusing, not because something is wrong, but because something deeply intelligent is taking place beneath conscious control. You might notice waves of fatigue arriving without a clear reason, even on days when you have rested enough and done very little. And this tiredness can feel different from ordinary exhaustion, heavier yet quieter, as if the body is asking for permission to slow down rather than demanding repair. Sleep patterns may shift in ways that feel inconvenient or strange, with nights of light sleep followed by sudden deep rest, early awakenings paired with afternoons of drowsiness, or dreams that feel more vivid and emotionally charged than before, all reflecting an inner system recalibrating itself without consulting the mind. Your appetite may change as well, not driven by willpower or intention, but by a subtle loss of interest in certain foods and a natural gravitation toward simplicity, because the body often releases old habits. At the same time, consciousness releases old identities. Sounds that once blended into the background may suddenly feel louder, sharper, or more intrusive, while bright lights, crowded spaces, and fast-moving environments may overwhelm you more easily, not as a weakness, but as a sign that your sensory system is becoming more refined and less numbed. You may find yourself unusually sensitive to the emotional tone of places and people, sensing tension, heaviness, or calm before a word is spoken, because the body often perceives shifts in energy long before the mind learns how to name them. This heightened sensitivity can feel like vulnerability at first, especially in a culture that praises toughness and endurance, yet it is actually a form of intelligence returning to the body after years of being ignored, overridden, or trained to endure what never felt right. Physical sensations may arise without a clear medical explanation, such as pressure in the chest, tightness in the throat, warmth along the spine, or heaviness in the limbs, not as signs of danger, but as signals of stored emotional energy moving and reorganizing itself. The body remembers what the mind forgets, including moments of fear, suppression, grief, and adaptation. And when consciousness begins to awaken, those memories often surface not as stories, but as sensations, asking to be felt rather than analyzed. You may feel the urge to stretch more, to breathe more deeply, to walk slowly, or to sit quietly, because the body is guiding you back into a rhythm that aligns with presence instead of urgency. There can be moments when you feel detached from your usual physical strength or motivation, as if the old drive to push, prove, and persist has quietly faded, making space for a different kind of energy that values alignment over endurance. This loss of momentum is often misunderstood as laziness or decline, but in truth, it reflects a shift away from survival-based effort toward a more integrated way of being, where action arises from clarity rather than pressure. The nervous system, having spent years in subtle states of alertness, performance, or defense, begins to unwind, and this unwinding can temporarily feel like weakness, vulnerability, or instability before it settles into deeper resilience. As the body adjusts, it may require more rest, more water, more gentleness, and more patience than you are accustomed to giving. And this request is not negotiable through logic or discipline, because it comes from a level of intelligence that responds only to listening. You may notice that forcing yourself through fatigue now creates stronger consequences than before, as if the body has withdrawn its tolerance for self-betrayal, making it increasingly difficult to ignore what it needs. This stage often brings frustration, because the mind wants progress, clarity, and productivity, while the body asks for slowing down, uncertainty, and care, creating an inner tension that can only be resolved through surrender rather than control. Your relationship with your body may change as well, shifting from something you use or manage into something you begin to respect as a partner in your awakening, capable of guiding you if you are willing to listen. Old symptoms may briefly return or intensify, not as regression, but as unresolved patterns, surfacing for integration, much like sediment rising in water before it clears. The body does not heal in straight lines, and awakening is no exception, because release often looks messy before it becomes gentle, and confusing before it becomes simple. You may feel emotions move through your body without attaching to a specific story, with sadness appearing as heaviness, fear as tightness, or relief as warmth, teaching you that feeling does not require explanation to be valid. As sensitivity increases, you may need to become more intentional with your environment, choosing quieter spaces, slower conversations, and fewer obligations, not to withdraw from life, but to meet it with honesty instead of overwhelm. This is a period when the body is recalibrating its frequency, letting go of patterns built in survival mode, and adjusting to a state of presence that feels unfamiliar but deeply restorative. The body has its own timeline, one that does not respond to deadlines, expectations, or comparison, and trying to rush this process often creates resistance rather than relief. You may begin to understand that awakening is not something happening only in thought or insight, but something rewriting the entire system, including posture, breath, digestion, sleep, and energy flow. This realization can be humbling, because it removes the illusion that consciousness lives only in the mind, revealing instead that awareness is embodied, lived, and expressed through every cell. Listening to the body during this time does not mean indulging every impulse, but honoring the difference between avoidance and genuine need, between distraction and rest. You may find yourself saying no more often, canceling plans, or leaving situations earlier than before, not out of fear, but out of respect for a system that no longer tolerates constant depletion. As the body settles into a new baseline, moments of unexpected calm may appear, even in the midst of uncertainty, offering brief glimpses of what it feels like to live without constant internal resistance. These moments may be fleeting at first, but they leave an impression, a quiet knowing that this discomfort has a direction, and that beneath the fatigue and sensitivity, something more coherent is forming. The mind may continue to question whether this is normal, whether something is being lost, or whether you are becoming less capable, yet the body speaks a different truth through sensation rather than argument. That truth is simple and uncompromising, asking not for understanding, but for trust. Trust that the body knows how to reorganize itself when given space. Trust that rest is not failure. Trust that sensitivity is not weakness. Trust that awakening is not limited to insight, but includes the slow and intimate work of embodiment. When you stop fighting these physical changes and begin to meet them with curiosity and kindness, the body gradually responds with greater stability, clarity, and ease. Energy begins to return in a quieter form, less explosive but more sustainable, less driven but more aligned. And in that shift, you may realize that what once felt like strange symptoms were actually messages, guiding you out of a life lived in tension and into a way of being that honors the intelligence of the whole system. Awakening does not bypass the body, and it does not ask the body to keep up with the mind, but instead invites the entire organism to move together toward coherence. This stage can be uncomfortable, unpredictable, and deeply personal, yet it carries a quiet assurance that nothing is being broken and that something far more integrated is being formed. The body is not betraying you during this time. It is finally being included. And when you begin to listen rather than resist, the strange sensations soften, the fatigue finds rhythm, and the body becomes not an obstacle on the path of awakening, but one of its most honest teachers. 8. You no longer feel the need to fix others. There comes a quiet but unmistakable shift when the urge to correct, convince, or rescue other people begins to dissolve. Not because you have become indifferent, but because something deeper has settled inside you and no longer needs validation through being right. You may notice that situations which once triggered long explanations, inner arguments, or the need to prove your perspective now pass through you with far less resistance, as if the energy required to defend your truth has simply lost its appeal. This does not happen because you suddenly agree with everyone or believe that all choices lead to the same outcomes, but because you recognize that truth cannot be transferred through force, logic, or persuasion, and that insight ripens only when someone is ready to receive it. In earlier stages of awakening, there is often a strong impulse to share, explain, and awaken others, driven by sincerity but also subtly fueled by the ego's need to see its own clarity reflected back. And when that impulse fades, it can feel confusing at first. You may even question whether you are becoming passive or disengaged. Yet what is actually happening is a maturation of awareness, where understanding no longer requires outward demonstration to feel real. You begin to see that every person is moving through life with a unique nervous system, a unique history of conditioning, and a unique pace of integration, and that interrupting this process rarely creates freedom, even when the intention is loving. The desire to fix others often carries an unspoken belief that something is wrong with the present moment, and as your consciousness settles, that belief weakens, replaced by a deeper acceptance of what is. You start to sense that growth imposed from the outside tends to create resistance rather than transformation, and that the most profound shifts in your own life rarely came from someone convincing you, but from experiences that met you when you were ready. This realization softens your interactions, because you no longer approach conversations as opportunities to correct or improve, but as moments to listen, witness, and respond with honesty rather than agenda. Silence becomes easier, not as withdrawal, but as respect for the natural intelligence guiding each person's unfolding. even when that unfolding looks messy, slow, or contradictory from the outside. You may notice that you no longer feel responsible for other people's emotions, reactions, or choices. And this release brings a surprising sense of relief, because carrying that responsibility was never sustainable. Compassion begins to replace judgment, not as a moral decision, but as a natural consequence of seeing how much of human behavior is shaped by unconscious fear, inherited patterns, and unmet needs. When someone disagrees with you, misunderstands you, or continues along a path you would not choose, the inner tension that once arose begins to loosen, because you recognize that disagreement does not threaten your truth. You stop measuring conversations by whether someone changes their mind, and instead, notice the quality of presence you bring into the exchange, realizing that presence itself often communicates more than words ever could. There is a quiet humility in this stage, because you see how often your past certainty was shaped by limited perspective, and how many of your own beliefs shifted not through argument, but through lived experience. This humility does not weaken you, but grounds you, making it easier to hold strong values without needing to impose them, and clear boundaries without needing to justify them. You may still share insights when asked, speak honestly when necessary, and offer guidance when invited. Yet the energy behind these actions is different, calmer, less urgent, and free from the need to control outcomes. You begin to trust that life is a far better teacher than you could ever be, and that each person's challenges are shaping them in ways that cannot be rushed or replaced. The need to fix others often masks a deeper discomfort with uncertainty, and as you grow more comfortable not knowing how everything will unfold, that need loses its grip. You may notice that relationships feel lighter, because there is less hidden expectation, less disappointment when people do not change, and more room for genuine connection as they are. This shift can be especially noticeable with family members or close relationships, where patterns of advice, correction, or emotional management may have existed for years, and stepping out of those roles can feel both liberating and disorienting. At times, others may even react to your change, sensing that you are no longer engaging in familiar dynamics, and this can create temporary distance or confusion. Yet over time, a new equilibrium often forms. You learn that allowing others to be where they are does not mean abandoning discernment or tolerating harm, but choosing your responses from clarity rather than compulsion. Boundaries become cleaner because they are no longer enforced through explanation or emotional charge, but through simple, consistent action aligned with your values. You begin to understand that love does not require agreement, and that respect does not require sameness, and this understanding brings a deeper peace into your interactions. There is a subtle grief that may arise as well, recognizing how much energy you once spent trying to change others in order to feel safe, understood, or validated, and allowing that grief to pass becomes part of your own healing. As this phase settles, your attention naturally turns inward, not in self-obsession, but in responsibility, because you see clearly that the only life you are here to live and embody is your own. You begin to invest more energy in alignment than influence, more care into how you show up than how others respond. And this shift quietly transforms the quality of your presence. People may still seek your perspective, but they sense that you are no longer attached to their agreement. And this very lack of attachment often makes your words land more deeply. You realize that when advice is not driven by the need to be heard or followed, it carries a different tone, one that feels spacious rather than heavy. In this space, love becomes less conditional, less transactional, and less tied to outcomes, because it is no longer filtered through the ego's need to manage reality. This is not detachment in the sense of emotional distance, but a deeper intimacy with life as it is, allowing others the dignity of their own timing and lessons. You may come to see that your greatest contribution is not in fixing or correcting, but in embodying the clarity, compassion, and groundedness you once searched for outside yourself. That embodiment speaks quietly, without argument, and invites rather than demands, offering a living example rather than a set of instructions. This is a sign of mature awareness, because it reflects a trust in the unfolding of consciousness itself, rather than a belief that awakening must be enforced or accelerated. As you rest more fully in this understanding, relationships simplify, inner conflict decreases, and the world feels slightly less heavy, not because everyone has changed, but because you no longer need them to. And in that release, you discover a gentler way of being present with others, one rooted not in correction, but in compassion, not in control, but in quiet confidence. This stage does not announce itself with certainty or pride, but with ease, patience, and a deep respect for the mystery of each human journey. You realize that true maturity of consciousness is not measured by how much you understand, but by how little you need to impose that understanding on the world. And from that place, love flows more freely, because it is no longer tasked with fixing what was never broken, but simply witnessing what is learning to remember itself. 9. The greatest fear emerges, the fear of losing yourself. There often comes a point in awakening when a quiet but persistent question begins to surface beneath everything else, not as an intellectual curiosity, but as an emotional tremor that touches daily life, relationships, and moments of stillness. And that question sounds something like this: who am I really, when everything I used to rely on no longer feels solid? This question does not arrive dramatically, and it rarely announces itself as a spiritual milestone, but instead appears as a subtle unease, a sense that the familiar reference points of identity are dissolving, leaving behind a feeling that can be both empty and overwhelming at the same time. You may notice that roles you once inhabited with certainty no longer provide the same sense of grounding, whether those roles were tied to career, family, beliefs, personality traits, or even the story you have told yourself about who you are and how life works. As these structures begin to loosen, the ego responds with fear, not because something bad is happening, but because its function has always been to create continuity, predictability, and control. And when those functions are threatened, it interprets the change as danger. This fear can feel deeply personal, as if you are on the verge of disappearing, losing coherence, or slipping into something unknown without a map. And the mind may rush to label this experience as confusion, instability, or even failure. You may find yourself thinking more often about identity, purpose, and meaning, not in an abstract way, but with a kind of urgency that feels unfamiliar, as though the ground beneath your sense of self is shifting and you are searching for something to hold on to. The ego, sensing its diminishing authority, may intensify its activity, bringing waves of doubt, anxiety, and self-questioning, attempting to reconstruct an identity quickly, so that it does not have to face the discomfort of not knowing. This is often the stage where fear reaches its peak, because the old self has begun to dissolve, yet the deeper self has not fully revealed itself, creating a liminal space that feels like standing between two worlds without belonging to either. You may grieve the version of yourself that once felt clear and defined, even if that version was built around survival, adaptation, or external validation, because familiarity, even when limiting, often feels safer than openness. There can be moments when you long to return to who you used to be, not because that identity was more authentic, but because it was predictable, and predictability gave the illusion of control. This longing does not mean you are regressing, but that the nervous system is responding naturally to uncertainty, trying to protect you from what it cannot yet understand. The fear of losing yourself is not actually about loss, but about transition, because what is dissolving is not your essence, but the constructed image you learned to live inside. This image was shaped by conditioning, expectations, and experiences that taught you how to belong, how to be accepted, and how to survive. And while it served a purpose, it was never the whole truth of who you are. As this image begins to fade, the ego experiences it as a kind of death, not symbolic or poetic, but visceral and real, because its existence depends on maintaining a clear narrative of self. This death can feel frightening, disorienting, and deeply lonely, because the mind cannot conceptualize what lies beyond itself, and the familiar language of identity no longer applies. You may feel as though you are falling apart internally, even while appearing functional on the outside, carrying an unspoken fear that if you let go completely, there will be nothing left. Yet beneath this fear is a deeper intelligence quietly at work, guiding you toward a truth that cannot be accessed through effort, analysis, or self-improvement. This stage is often misunderstood as a crisis, when in reality, It is a threshold, one that nearly everyone who undergoes genuine inner transformation must cross. The dissolution of the ego does not happen all at once, and it does not happen without resistance, because the ego's role has always been to protect you from chaos by creating structure and meaning. When that structure loosens, fear arises, not because you are in danger, but because the mind is encountering a space it cannot dominate or define. This space can feel like emptiness, yet it is not empty in the way absence is empty, but open in the way a clear sky is open, holding infinite possibility without immediately revealing form. The discomfort here comes from the mind's habit of equating identity with existence, believing that without a clear sense of self, there is no stability or safety. What slowly becomes apparent, often through lived experience rather than insight, is that something remains even as identities dissolve, something that observes the fear without being consumed by it. This observing presence does not panic, does not rush to rebuild, and does not demand answers, because it is not dependent on form to exist. At first, you may only glimpse this presence briefly, perhaps in moments of quiet, during walks, or in pauses between thoughts. And these glimpses can feel grounding without being dramatic. Over time, these moments lengthen, and you begin to trust that awareness itself is stable, even when the stories it once inhabited fall away. The fear of losing yourself begins to soften when you realize that what you thought was you was actually a collection of roles, habits, beliefs, and coping mechanisms assembled over time. None of these were wrong, and none of them need to be rejected, yet none of them were the source of your being. The ego's death is not annihilation, but a shedding, a release of what was never meant to be permanent. This process rarely feels peaceful while it is happening, because surrender challenges everything the ego believes about control, effort, and safety. You may feel moments of panic, followed by moments of clarity, followed again by fear, creating a cycle that tests your willingness to stay present without grasping for certainty. Staying with this discomfort does not mean forcing acceptance or pretending to be calm, but allowing fear to exist without immediately acting on it or trying to escape. In doing so, you discover that fear itself is transient, rising and falling like a wave, while awareness remains steady beneath it. This realization does not arrive as a sudden enlightenment, but as a gradual shift in how you relate to inner experience, moving from identification to observation. The question, "Who am I?" slowly loses its urgency, not because it has been answered conceptually, but because the need for an answer dissolves. You begin to sense that who you are is not something to be defined, protected, or improved, but something that reveals itself naturally when you stop clinging to what you are not. What emerges is not a new identity in the traditional sense, but a deeper alignment, a way of being that feels quieter, more spacious, and less defensive. This does not make life free of challenge, but it changes the way challenges are met, because they are no longer filtered entirely through the fear of self-preservation. You realize that you are not losing yourself at all, but remembering yourself beyond the roles and stories that once felt necessary. This remembering does not require effort, belief, or affirmation, but patience, trust, and the willingness to remain present during uncertainty. The fear that once felt overwhelming begins to transform into humility, because you recognize how little the mind truly knows, and how much wisdom exists beyond its grasp. In this humility, there is relief, because the burden of maintaining a fixed identity falls away, allowing you to respond to life more fluidly. You may notice that moments of peace begin to appear unexpectedly, not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer resisting the unknown. The death of the ego is not an end, but a doorway, one that leads not to disappearance, but to a deeper intimacy with life itself. Passing through this doorway does not make you special or superior, but more human, more open, and more aligned with the natural unfolding of existence. You begin to live less from fear and more from presence, less from identity and more from awareness. And this shift quietly transforms how you experience yourself and the world. The greatest fear you faced was never about losing yourself, but about letting go of what you believed yourself to be. And on the other side of that letting go, there is not emptiness, but a gentle recognition that you were never truly lost. You are simply remembering who you are beyond the story. And that remembering does not arrive with certainty or finality, but with a quiet sense of home that does not depend on definition, explanation, or control. In this way, the fear becomes a teacher, guiding you through the dissolution of illusion and into a deeper, simpler truth that was always present, waiting for you to stop holding on and allow yourself to be found. 10. You begin to allow, instead of striving. There is a moment, often quiet and almost unnoticeable at first, when effort starts to feel heavier than trust, and striving loses its authority over your inner world. Not because you have given up on life, but because life no longer needs to be conquered in order to be lived. You may notice that the constant inner pressure to fix yourself, improve outcomes, or control the direction of events begins to soften, as if something inside you has finally grown tired of fighting the current and decided to feel the water instead. This shift does not come from a philosophy or a decision made by the mind, but from lived exhaustion, from realizing that forcing rarely brought peace, and that the moments of genuine clarity and ease always arrived when you were not trying so hard. You begin to sense the difference between aligned action and compulsive effort, recognizing that one flows naturally from presence, while the other is driven by fear, urgency, or the need to prove worth. In the past, effort may have felt noble, necessary, or even virtuous because it promised control and security. Yet over time, you see how much tension it carried, how much resistance it created within the body and the mind. Allowing does not mean becoming passive or indifferent, but shifting the source of action from anxiety to awareness, from reaction to responsiveness, and this change quietly transforms how you move through daily life. You may find that decisions arise more organically, without the familiar inner debate or mental struggle, as if clarity now arrives on its own when you are present enough to notice it. There is less need to plan every detail or anticipate every outcome, because you are no longer trying to outthink life, and this brings a subtle but profound relief to the nervous system. Trust begins to replace vigilance, not as blind optimism, but as a grounded confidence that you can meet whatever arises without needing to control it in advance. This trust grows from experience, from witnessing how life continued to unfold even when your plans dissolved, and how some of the most meaningful moments emerged from uncertainty rather than control. You may notice that your relationship with time changes, because urgency fades and patience becomes more natural, allowing moments to complete themselves instead of being rushed toward resolution. Presence becomes more important than progress, because you begin to feel that being fully here carries its own intelligence, one that guides action more accurately than constant analysis. When challenges appear, there is less immediate resistance and more curiosity, because you no longer interpret difficulty as failure, but as part of a larger movement that does not require your constant interference. Allowing creates space for emotions to move through you without being managed or suppressed. And this natural movement raises your emotional baseline without effort or strategy. As resistance falls away, energy that was once tied up in tension becomes available for creativity, connection, and rest. And you may be surprised by how much lighter your inner world feels. You begin to notice that when you stop pushing against reality, reality often responds with greater ease, not because you are controlling outcomes, but because you are no longer creating unnecessary friction. This alignment feels less like achievement and more like cooperation, as if you are finally working with life instead of against it. There is a growing sense that you do not need to earn peace, prove worth, or deserve rest, because these qualities emerge naturally when you stop opposing the present moment. You may find yourself pausing more often, breathing more deeply, and responding more slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the moment as it is. This slowing down allows you to perceive subtleties you once missed, including intuitive nudges, emotional shifts, and quiet insights that guide you without force. Allowing also brings a new relationship with uncertainty, where not knowing no longer feels threatening, but spacious, opening possibilities instead of closing them. You may realize that much of your previous striving was an attempt to avoid discomfort, and that by allowing discomfort to exist without resistance, it often dissolves on its own. This does not mean pain disappears, but that suffering decreases, because you are no longer adding layers of judgment and control on top of natural experience. As you practice allowing, the body relaxes, the breath deepens, and the mind becomes less noisy, creating a coherent state that feels both grounded and open. This coherence is not something you generate, but something you uncover when you stop disrupting it with constant effort. Your vibration, though you may not think of it in those terms, naturally shifts as alignment replaces resistance, because inner states change when they are no longer forced. You begin to sense that your presence influences your environment more than your effort ever did, and that calm clarity often invites cooperation without demand. This realization can feel humbling, because it reveals how little control was ever truly needed, and how much energy was spent trying to manage what was already unfolding. Allowing also deepens compassion, because you recognize in others the same patterns of striving and resistance you once carried, and you meet them with understanding rather than impatience. There is a subtle joy in this stage, not ecstatic or dramatic, but steady and reliable, arising from the absence of inner conflict rather than the presence of constant pleasure. You may still set intentions, pursue goals, and engage with the world, but the quality of engagement is different, lighter, less attached, and more responsive to what actually is. When things do not go as expected, disappointment passes more quickly, because it is no longer tied to your sense of identity or worth. You begin to trust that life has its own intelligence, one that does not need to be directed but can be collaborated with through presence and openness. This collaboration feels like being carried rather than pushed, like floating with the current instead of swimming upstream, and it brings a sense of ease that effort could never sustain. You may notice moments when everything feels synchronized, not because life is perfect, but because you are no longer resisting its movement. This synchronization does not require belief or affirmation, but arises naturally when inner conflict dissolves and awareness aligns with what is happening. Allowing creates a spaciousness in which insight, healing, and connection can occur without being forced, because space itself is transformative. You may find that problems resolve in unexpected ways, conversations soften, and opportunities arise not through pursuit, but through availability. This stage is not an endpoint, but a way of being, one that continues to deepen as you practice letting life meet you where you are. You realize that allowing is not something you do once, but a moment-by-moment orientation toward experience, choosing presence over resistance again and again. As this orientation stabilizes, the sense of being in harmony with something larger than yourself becomes more tangible, not as a concept, but as a felt experience of coherence. You feel less separate from the flow of life, less at odds with circumstances, and more at home within your own experience. This is the point where effort relaxes into trust, control softens into cooperation, and striving gives way to a quiet confidence that does not need to announce itself. You are no longer trying to align with life, because you realize that life has been inviting alignment all along. And in this allowing, you discover that what you were seeking through effort was already present beneath resistance, waiting for you to stop pushing and simply let yourself be carried. This is not surrender as defeat, but surrender as wisdom, a recognition that the deepest transformations occur not when you try harder, but when you finally allow yourself to move with the current rather than against it. In this state, you are not dissolving into something vague or abstract, but becoming more fully yourself, expressed without force, aligned without effort, and present without resistance. This is the quiet fulfillment of awakening, not marked by certainty or control, but by a deep and steady trust in the intelligence that moves through you and everything else. You are not broken, you are awakening. There is a simple truth that deserves to be spoken gently and clearly, especially after everything you may have experienced, questioned, and endured along this path. And that truth is this: the signs you are noticing are not mistakes, not detours, and not evidence that something has gone wrong, but invitations, quiet and sometimes uncomfortable invitations, into a deeper level of awareness. What you have been moving through is not a failure of character, strength, or intelligence, but a natural response of consciousness when it begins to outgrow the structures that once held it together, much like a house that no longer fits the life unfolding inside it. It is important to remember this, because when familiar identities dissolve, when emotions intensify, when relationships change, and when effort gives way to uncertainty, the mind often rushes to a harsh conclusion, assuming that something is broken and needs to be fixed. Yet awakening rarely feels like progress while it is happening, because it dismantles before it rebuilds, it questions before it clarifies, and it asks you to let go long before it reveals what is next. If you find yourself feeling lost, exhausted, confused, or even afraid at times, it does not mean you are moving backward, but that you are passing through a threshold where old ways of being no longer apply and new ones have not yet fully formed. This in-between space can feel lonely, especially in a world that celebrates certainty, productivity, and clear identities. Yet it is precisely here that the most honest transformation takes place. You are not alone in this experience, even when it feels deeply personal and difficult to articulate, because countless others have walked this quiet terrain, often without language for what was happening, trusting something they could not yet see. There is no timeline you are failing to meet, and no version of yourself you are falling behind, because awakening does not follow linear progress or social expectation, but unfolds according to an inner rhythm that cannot be rushed. What matters most in this stage is not understanding everything that is happening, but allowing it to happen without turning against yourself. Soften the impulse to label your experience as a problem, and notice how much energy has been spent trying to return to who you used to be, even when that version of you was built around survival, adaptation, and effort. There is nothing wrong with who you were, and there is nothing missing in who you are becoming. Because this process is not about improvement, but about remembrance. You may notice how often the mind tries to project forward, asking when clarity will return, when peace will settle, or when you will finally arrive somewhere stable. Yet these questions quietly assume that wholeness exists somewhere else. Awakening gently dismantles that assumption, not by giving you a better future identity, but by inviting you into a deeper relationship with the present moment as it is. This is why forcing answers, rushing healing, or trying to become someone else often creates more tension than relief, because the process itself is asking for patience rather than effort. Allow yourself to rest in not knowing, even when that feels uncomfortable, because not knowing is not emptiness, but openness, a space where truth can emerge without being shaped by expectation. You do not need to hurry into certainty, purpose, or clarity, because whatever is real will reveal itself in its own time, without being chased. Notice how much softer life becomes when you stop demanding that it make sense immediately, and how much gentler you become with yourself when you stop trying to prove that you are okay. This is not resignation or passivity, but a deeper form of trust, one that recognizes that growth does not always look like forward motion, and healing does not always feel good. When you allow the process instead of resisting it, something subtle begins to shift, not all at once, but gradually. As the nervous system relaxes and the mind loosens its grip, moments of quiet clarity may begin to appear, not as grand revelations, but as small recognitions, a sense of ease while walking, a breath that feels fuller, a moment of presence that does not require explanation. These moments are not accidents, but glimpses of what becomes possible when you stop searching for yourself outside of your own experience. The more you release the need to define yourself, the more space there is for authenticity to arise naturally, without performance or pressure. You may begin to realize that much of what you once sought through achievement, validation, or spiritual striving was actually a longing to feel whole, safe, and at home within yourself. Awakening does not grant these things as rewards, but reveals that they were never truly absent, only obscured by layers of identity, fear, and effort. This realization is often quiet, because truth does not need to announce itself loudly. It simply feels familiar, like remembering something you always knew, but forgot you knew. As you move forward, or perhaps more accurately, as you settle more deeply into where you are, let go of the idea that awakening should look a certain way, or feel a certain way. There is no correct pace, no ideal personality, and no final version you need to become in order to be considered awakened. What matters is honesty with your experience, kindness toward your process, and the willingness to stay present even when clarity is incomplete. When you stop trying to fix yourself, you begin to hear what is actually being asked of you. And often that request is surprisingly simple: to rest, to feel, to listen, and to allow. You may discover that life responds differently when you meet it without armor, not because it becomes easier, but because you are no longer fighting yourself within it. This is where a deeper connection to your own being begins to stabilize, not through effort or belief, but through lived presence. When you stop searching for answers outside, comparing your path to others, or measuring your worth by progress, something settles, and in that settling, truth becomes clearer. You begin to sense that awareness itself is steady, even when emotions fluctuate and circumstances change. And this steadiness becomes a quiet anchor. From this place, compassion for yourself grows naturally, because you see how much you have carried, how much you have adapted, and how deeply you have tried to make sense of life. You no longer need to be harsh in order to grow, because growth is happening whether you push it or not. Awakening, at its core, is not about becoming better, more spiritual, or more advanced, but about remembering what was always intact beneath the layers of conditioning. It is the recognition that you are not a problem to be solved, but a life to be lived consciously. When you stop chasing wholeness and allow yourself to be here, as you are, something profound but simple reveals itself. You were never incomplete. You were never behind. You were never broken. What you are experiencing is the natural undoing of what you are not, so that what you are can finally breathe. And this remembering does not require effort, affirmation, or belief, only honesty, patience, and the courage to stop running from your own experience. As you allow this process to unfold, gently and without demand, clarity will continue to emerge, not as a final answer, but as a lived understanding that deepens over time. Awakening is not about becoming someone new. It is about remembering that you were already whole. And when that remembering settles in, quietly and without drama, you realize that nothing was ever truly missing, and nothing essential was ever lost. You were not falling apart. You were waking up.